Welcome to Ask SME Anything. Your chance to ask the ITProTV subject matter experts questions live. Here's your host, Don Pizzette.
Welcome back to Ask SME Anything, the show here on ITProTV where you, the viewer, get to ask questions of our subject matter experts. And if you've been watching ITProTV live this week, then you already know we've got special guests in studio. We have Mr. Brad Stine and Rob Carson from SemperSec here doing some security training with us. I managed to rope Brad in to come and do a segment on Ask SME Anything. Brad, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So for those who aren't familiar with Brad, actually, let's start off here, because if someone hasn't been watching the live training, they might not know, because this is the first time we've had you here in our studio, and it has been a load of fun. Would you mind just doing kind of a brief introduction for our viewers about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Brad Stine, and I've done a lot of things. I've gone everything from being a consultant, doing pen testing, building teams, did a little bit of instant response, been on the blue team, utilizing my pen testing skills, for both the good and the bad, to be honest. So it's a little bit of jack of all trades, but I primarily like application testing. That's where I spend a lot of my focus and time. I give back to the community and all kinds of good stuff.
Awesome. And Brad's been in studio with us helping to create our practical security track, where he's kind of been showing what life as a pen tester actually is like and all the things that are involved, because it's not all Mr. Robot. So what we're going to be doing today is throwing some questions at him. And really, if you have questions on any security-related topic, or especially pen testing type topics, this is a great time to send them in. Remember, you can send us our questions live right this very second if you want, just by jumping on Twitter and throwing a question out there. Use hashtag AskSMEAnything. It's right there on the screen. And when I say SME, that's SME, like subject matter expert. Throw that tweet out there. We will see it. Our social media team grabs it, throws it at me, and we get it live here during the show. If you happen to be an ITProTV subscriber, we have a special treat for you, which is you can go to the ITProTV site and use the Q&A forums to post a question. We prioritize those and make sure they get answered first. We try to get to everybody, but we do spoil our ITProTV subscribers by giving them kind of first access here. So speaking of first access, we've already got a handful of questions here queued up for you, Brad. So we're going to jump right into that first one. And this question is coming at us from Twitter. Looks like Amanda was asking, what types of custom scripts should I be developing for my personal engagement toolkit? And I might have to express a little naivety here, because I'm not exactly sure what a personal engagement toolkit is. So what type of scripts would we need in this thing that I don't know what it is?
All right, so let's first talk about the personal engagement toolkit. And the way I'm understanding that is what do I bring? You know what I mean? And so when I'm going on, how do I use it? What do I use when I go on site, or am I doing an assessment on, say, an application? And, to start, I'd say it really depends on the type of application or assessment that you're doing. So if I'm doing a lot of web applications, I'm going to do scripts specifically around that stuff that's going to automate my life and make it easier. Maybe it's to help get things, faster. If you're doing more of the network, your footprinting tasks that you do, when you go on site, you're going to do X, Y, and Z every time, right? So automate that. There's no reason for you to have to go into a command line interface and type in each one every engagement. Have your little bash script, right? Run through the things, spit it out into whatever format you want it. And that way you saved yourself time. You saved yourself, a lot of times when you go on site, that first half hour to an hour, you're going to have the security guy watching you. They want to see what you're doing. They think what you're doing is really cool, right? They want to do it. And so a lot of times when they're watching and talking to you, you start typing away, doing your commands, and I'm throwing errors. I can't spell. It's just like doing a presentation. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I can't speak. So, it really is to automate what you're doing. I don't think there's a true set of things. But one of the things that I also have that I think is very valuable is for your setup of your system. As you're doing your engagement, you have your build of your whether it's Kali or you have your own homegrown platform that you're using. automate that. Have a script to set it up the same way every time, right? I've seen people who have gone on site and for whatever reason they had to redo their laptop. When they sanitize it from customer to customer, they refresh it. Things aren't quite set the same, right? And so when you're on site, you end up redoing or figuring out how your laptop's set up. And again, that's inefficiencies. So you want to make yourself as efficient as possible.
Now, you mentioned when you were kind of starting out there about bash scripting, and I know as a system administrator, I automate a ton of things with simple bash scripts or shell scripts. Do you go more advanced? Do you do things like Python or Perl, or do you just find you can achieve most of what you need with bash?
For setup and configuration, bash is fine. Now, I might combine that with Python. I'm a Python lover. Like, I use it all the time. So, my outputs, I may have Python that'll take those and do the next step with it. That you can do your greps and your set in aux and sort of format stuff. But, there are sometimes some things that like, hey, let's take a Python script, let's pull out some information, and then we can pipe it into, say, my vulnerability scanner or whatever it is using an API. And so those are the types of things that, again, you're just trying to automate as much as possible and make yourself as efficient without missing any of the details that you really need.
So I imagine a lot of that's going to come up the first time you go out and do an engagement, right? Or maybe not the first, second, third, fourth. You probably continually evolve that over time to make it more and more refined because you learn what you're doing,
absolutely,
what you are repeating over and over again. But if somebody wanted to try and get a head start on that, so they haven't been on their first engagement yet, they're still learning, would they? I imagine they'd start to see that even just practicing in labs and running through routines, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think through the CTFs is a great example, right? So as you're learning, you're probably doing a certain set of CTFs or CTFs of a certain kind. Figure out what's similar. What do you do every time you start a CTF? Every time you get in there, whether it's the report building to submit the flag or you're doing your discovery or you're pulling, you're going to find what works for you and you're going to repeat it. Like you get a system. I know what I generally can find the vulnerability in, right? Or what is generally successful for me. So I'm going to start there, right? It's not like I have this A, B, and C, but I'm going to go to where I feel most comfortable. And most people are the same way. So if you can automate those places that you end up going and exploring first, again, automate it because most of the time it's the second or third opportunities that work. So the more you can automate, the further you can go and invest it and try non-standard types of attacks.
I've seen some examples of scripts people had built up that were, as soon as they achieved a shell on a device, that they had a series of commands they would run just to gather software versions and things. Have you built, or if you had a need to build things out like that, or is it more like on the discovery side, maybe Nmap or Netcat type scans to reach out and find machines?
No, absolutely. Well, it depends on the system, right? And the type of payload. So if I get, say, shell on a Linux system, absolutely, right? I'm going to try to run a certain set of commands. The who am I's to get information. I want to know the IP addresses. What are my, just drop all the basic host information. If it's a Windows system, I'll go into PowerShell, right? And we're going to start dropping everything we can from there. And so, but again, all you're doing is doing a discovery on that system now. Right, so it's kind of the same thing. Post-exploitation, though, as soon as you get your shell, right, have your payloads to maintain access, right, and so that way you don't have to re-exploit it. More often than not, the more you exploit that same vulnerability, the more unstable that system is. And so you don't want to keep running that exploit over and over and over to come back to where you are. So you want to make sure that you ensure you maintain that access, say another route that is a little bit more stable.
Yeah, and I think that's a skill that'll be something that's valuable to people throughout their entire career and continually evolving.
For sure. And I think that one of the things that is great is when you're first starting out, if you can get on a team, right? Some of the larger firms, and even the small boutiques will give you a team. You'll go out with somebody a little more seasoned, right? And so you'll see what they're automating, and you'll ask questions. I mean, really, that's where I learned a lot more than even in the trainings. I'm trying to give good information here, but there's people a lot smarter than I am, and they have different experiences or they've run into different things, and they found if I automate this, or if I have this available to me, my life just becomes that much easier. And so you start learning and adopting, and taking everybody's experiences and growing into your own personal engagement toolkit.
All right. Well, I think that's excellent advice to just about anybody out there, and just gives you an idea that this is not necessarily a one size fits all type thing. That you're going to need different scripting for different situations. All right. Well, with that in mind, let's move on to our next question. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, you can certainly throw them out to us. Use that hashtag Ask SME Anything on Twitter or via the ITProTV Q&A forums. So our next question is: as a pen tester, should I be specializing, or is it better to be a jack of all trades? And I know you mentioned how you're kind of a jack of all trades.
Yep.
You've fallen into that role, but I do know there's pen testers. I've spoken to a few who focus specifically on Wi-Fi pen testing, or specifically on web applications. So what's your opinion on this one?
The guys that specialize are amazing. Quite frankly, I've some of my friends, I put them in the top 1% of pen testers, but they're a top 1% of a web application or of certain things, right? I know some people that do who are developers who can take applications that you don't think they're secure, and next thing you know they have it doing something that you're like, where did this even come from? I think the jack of all trades is good to get into the industry. But eventually, even if you try to maintain your journalist practice, you're going to end up specializing in something. You're just going to be interested in, like, something's going to pique your interest, and you're going to start going that way. I think it's very difficult not to be a specialist in some form or fashion.
Do you, like, for you, I know you try and be that jack of all trades, but do you find there's a particular area that piques your interest?
Web applications. I think one of the things for me is that's where everything's going, right? Rich clients are going away, applications. That's where the data is, right? And so, to me, that's what gets me excited. I've had the opportunity to work at software development companies, right? And so, as a blue team person, I was able to use my pen testing skills to validate exploits. And when I'm working with, say, R&D, and trying to get them to remediate or fix, a vulnerability, and they're saying it's not vulnerable, you can't do this, right? Well, no, actually here, right, I'm going to throw up Burp Suite, and I'm going to show you how I just exploited it. And so at that point, they can't really argue with me, and we get it remediated. And so, it just, with where my career has gone, and again, I find applications interesting.
So let's talk about web applications for a second, because right now we are seeing this resurgence that everybody's making a push to deploy applications via web pages, so we don't have to deal with clients anymore. They're multi-platform out of the box. It's a great solution. We also see this big push for DevOps now, where the developers are trying to maintain the entire infrastructure from that web page all the way to the back-end database. And in my experience, I've seen where that's a big challenge for developers, because they're not necessarily receiving the training they need, and they're being expected to maintain all of this infrastructure that in previous years they had a whole sysadmin team that was there to maintain.
Right.
So has that made your job easier? Like, do you find that the DevOps movement has kind of made it where it's easy for you to find weaknesses and flaws, or does it matter?
Yes and no. So it depends on the maturity of DevOps. So, for example, the credentials. It all boils back to credentials, right? So I'm not maybe targeting your sysadmins as much, right? I'm looking for the service accounts that do the deployments. And then can I find can I find your open share on your network that may have your base VM or your base build? Can I modify that, right? What happens when I find your base VM that you deploy, and I go in and I create an extra credential and I put it back? All you have to do is wait for your next build, because now my credentials are already in your system one step further, right? And so with a lot of the DevOps, and until you have, here's a buzzword, DevSecOps, right? Monitoring changes between stages and validating, right? My credentials can get all the way into production. And so all I did was I seeded my exploit, right? Once it's in production, I can leverage it to get what I need. And so the landscape has changed, right? It's credentials, right? At the end of the day, right? How do I get access? But with that being said, it's my target's different. Maybe you don't have access to the production environment anymore, or you know what I mean. So it's limiting the sysadmins, which is great because people are the weakest link. But it also means that there's service accounts that may not be monitored as closely as the sysadmins were, in which case you can propagate through into production.
And we've seen some examples of this lately. There was a popular Linux distro just a few weeks ago where their repository got compromised. So you would install it and already had the back door.
Exactly.
There's instances where developers have posted their AWS keys into GitHub, and there was a group that had written a script that would crawl through GitHub harvesting these credentials and showing.
It's one place I look every time I go into an engagement for an application. I'll look on LinkedIn, find your developers, and I'm going to see if you guys have anything. Because quite honestly, you guys throw samples of code, you pull code, you follow code, right? It gives me a lot of good information about what that application's doing.
That's true. Yeah, and where I see a lot of problems pop up is that thanks to easy solutions like the cloud, where I can quickly deploy a Linux cluster or whatever, if I forget to go in and do updates, they fall behind on updates very quickly, and we start seeing things like the Equifax breach, which was largely just due to not updating their infrastructure.
Yep, absolutely. And with our DevOps, and I think that again, coming from on the blue team side and some of my experiences there, developing that DevSecOps and the configuration management tools and configurations, I think some of the traditional methodologies that we use have to get updated. As our, I'm going to call it, philosophy of development changes, so does the methodology of management, right? And so as a sysadmin, you now need to know how to script and automate. As a pen tester, I need to understand how to deploy a system. Right. And it's no longer just, hey, I know a system, I know an interface, vulnerability, exploit it. It's understanding what that application lifecycle looks like.
Yeah, and it's getting to be an increasingly challenging world because if you think about it, DevOps, there's a lot of developers out there saying, look, I'm having a hard enough time keeping up with my dev work, and now I have ops work on top of it. And now we say DevSecOps, like, okay, we're just going to stick more on there. Before you know it, it'll be DevSecOps accounting.
Right.
We got to do all the accounting. So, definitely people are behind the eight ball, but security is not an area where you can skim.
No, it definitely isn't. And I don't think there's enough professionals that have the understanding and the ability, really, to keep up. I see, going on site and talking to different security teams, right? You've got the people, the security operations side, managing, triaging, health checks, making sure that security controls are good to go, right? And then you've got even if you're a software, I'm gonna call it a security software engineer. I know it's not what they're typically called, but they're really good. They're developers with secure coding in mind, right? And so there's definitely a gap there to bridge, and we need more DevOps guys that want to get into security to help us out, because the more you can integrate the security and the configuration management in a secure manner, the better off we're going to be.
Absolutely. And, I'm checking my notes here. I should have read the questions before I started getting us on the DevOps track, because this next question is right in line with that. So we got our next question coming at us from hashtag Ask SME Anything. How does containerization and cloud services affect your testing methodology? This is really right in line with what we were just talking about, right?
Yep.
With DevOps, if they don't have the time to learn the operational infrastructure underneath, a container saves them from that, and they can quickly containerize an app, deploy it, and be done with it.
Right.
As a pen tester, you probably used to look for individual hosts. Now, do you look for containers? What is that like?
I mean, a lot of the containers, right? They're listed on different ports. So when you see a host that now has 1,000, let's say 1,000 containers, right? So you're going to have 1,000 open ports that are all listening to the same thing. That's not we're not talking like 443. It's looking for HTTPS traffic on, anywhere from 9,000 to 10,000, right? And just making up a scope here, but you might be seeing something that is, it's either a listener or it's a container farm, like a swarm or something like that. And so, it definitely changes. And then you start having the footprint and try to identify what type of traffic you're looking at. So if you're on the network, you can, do the Wiresharks and network sniffing to get that information. But when you're when you're doing it remote, right, all of a sudden it becomes a little bit of a challenge. And when you are doing it external, because of load balancers and reverse proxies and how they work today, right, it's very difficult to identify a container versus a just a farm per se. But that's where the application security comes into play, right? Because in order for me to compromise, say, a swarm, let's go with Docker, and I have to already have compromised the application. I have to get shell in that container, see where I'm at, see how they configured it. Did they put some sort of credentials in there to run some process or an update process there, right? Start harvesting information that you can, but you have to, like I said, you have to first exploit the application.
Now, what's your experience been on with containers when it comes to the operating system? That I know Red Hat, Ubuntu, they both have special container versions of their OS. The Red Hat one, I think, is below 200 megs in size, very, very small. I know there's a Debian one that's under 100 megs.
Right.
And these OSs, when you normally deploy them, they have a ton of infrastructure that's part of the default install image, and it's a lot of attack surface. But the containers seem to be really, really stripped down.
I think it's doing the permissions on a system like we should have been all along. I mean, in all reality, right? I don't have access to the underlying kernel directly, right? The containerization and the virtualization that's happening there is that middleware that prevents me from, say, manipulating the IP tables of the host. You know what I'm saying? So it really is in a good direction. The problem is getting it more widespread. It's great for companies and corporations that have a bunch of systems that are the same, right? But when you're talking about a normal enterprise environment, does it make sense yet? Does the overhead to invest and get there, is that something that the business is trying to get to, or is it sort of an afterthought? So,
and we do hear horror stories about usually security researchers, at least we hope, that are finding ways to escape a container.
Absolutely.
And then, now they're able to affect other containers or affect the host underneath. If you can affect the host underneath, it's just a short distance to be able to compromise the repos that store those images. Now you have a big deal.
Absolutely. And, my biggest concern is, so if you look at a lot of our SaaS offerings today across the board, right, multi-tenancy is a huge thing, right? That's how they save costs. They put it in AWS or whatever infrastructure they want. Pivoting to another customer is interesting, right? So I'm customer A, I want to get to customer B, right? You offer a free community version of your product. Can I get to your paid customers, right? Am I in the same container, server or the swarm or whatever, right? And so that's where getting to that underlying infrastructure gets a lot of fun, because if I can pivot to, say, another customer that's paying, what kind of data is there?
And that's part of what created all the, I guess, drama will be the word that I choose here for the Meltdown and Spectre attacks at the end of last year that allowed for people to finally do that, where you could affect other customers in these services. By and large, I think for most enterprises, it wasn't a big deal, but if you were a cloud provider, it was huge.
Oh, huge. Yep, so. Exactly.
All right, well, containers aren't going anywhere anytime soon. They're going to be around for a while, and they're a staple piece of that DevOps environment. So definitely something you want to learn about, as you encounter that more. It's almost a given now, I think. Most environments you're going to encounter containers.
I think it's not quite there yet. If you're talking about enterprise spaces that provide services, absolutely. If you're talking about maybe a retail store or different verticals, hospitals aren't using it yet.
It's still the traditional model.
Yeah, traditional models is what you see.
I guess a lot of them were really slow to adopt virtualization at all, right?
Well, I think let's look at the risk, right? And so you have on healthcare, government, those types of things, right? They have their strict regulations and compliances and stuff like that, and integrating new technologies like containerizations, again, the multi-tenancy, the shared resources, that's kind of scary for certain organizations. And what is I think back, 4 years ago, cloud was like, I couldn't use cloud in where I was working. You know what I mean? Like, no.
Yeah.
Right. And so now it's becoming, with Office 365 and stuff, it's becoming more and more accepted. However, it's still one of those things that we gotta be careful of.
If you're dealing with patient medical records, financial data,
right.
well, with GDPR, even just any personally identifiable information,
Absolutely.
it impacts on that. All right, let's see. I believe we have one more question in our queue here, which is, it's a nice big question. This will work out well. So this is a question coming at us from hashtag Ask SME Anything. And just a reminder to everybody watching, if you have a question, make sure you throw it out there on Twitter. Again, just tag on that hashtag Ask SME Anything. So this question comes from Ruby, and she's asking, in your opinion, what is the most important phase of a pen test?
Well, let's put it this way. I spent 2 days now recording pre-engagement stuff. So I'm spending a lot of time there. From a pen tester's point of view, I think it's most important. One, it's your authorization and to ensure that you're looking at the right thing. Two, it ensures that you're going to be successful and you're going to deliver what you need to. A lot of times we want to just jump in. I know I do. I love getting technical and getting dirty, but that can cause us problems at the end. Now, from a consumer of a pen test, right, it's all about the deliverable. I'm paying you for a deliverable. I'm not paying for you to have fun on my network.
Yeah, so I guess depending on the perspective, which phase is most important.
Right.
So what you're basically saying is that as the pen tester, all the pre-authorization work, I mean, that's your safety net, that's your safeguard. You've got to have that in place.
I'm getting paid to do something that's illegal, right? And so you are giving me authorization to do something illegal against you.
And then from the customer's perspective, the reporting and finding at the end, that's the most important because that's the deliverable that they want that they're going to be able to act on.
Absolutely. And, I think it's going to start changing here in the near future, especially with the changes in the data privacy laws. GDPR is, the prime example. It just went out in May. As a pen tester, my job is to go in, break, and quite frankly, exfiltrate, right? Or pillage all the data I can. What do I do with that data? Does the vendor or the company know what I do with the data? Do I process that data? A really good example of this would be if I come in and say I do get access to Active Directory and I pull everybody's information, all the accounts and everything else. Depending on how you have your Active Directory, I could have a lot of PII or I just have names, numbers, and phone numbers. Still PII. And let's go with I have got 2 UK offices. And the UK offices have, EMEA citizens, right? I'm now have GDPR in scope data, right? So how does a company protect their PII, especially with pen testing and stuff like that? Now I know that there are mechanisms. It's an audit, right? So I got the protections, but is that really enough? Because again, if I take those credentials and I start throwing them into my, my hasher cracking rig back in the lab, and I'm adding those to my password tables or my rainbow tables or whatever, right? I'm processing the data that I'm getting. And so with that being said, it's a little more than just the assessment, getting the evidence, destroying the evidence, and retaining that report for whatever legal purposes. I'm actually processing some of that data to build my IP. So it'll be interesting to see where that really goes. But again, that GDPR is so new, and with the privacy laws, I mean, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think that's probably the sentiment that's represented by most people these days. It's going to be interesting. All right, let's see. That is, I believe, all the questions that we got coming in from the web. But I had a question myself that I wanted to throw. That somebody asked me once, and I didn't have a great answer for it. So I wanted to throw it on you and see how you did with it. If I'm in the role of the customer, right? So maybe I have a web application. I'm concerned about its security. I want to get somebody to test and validate, make sure everything's okay. So I come out, I hire you, right? Now, I want you to test my web application, but if I point you at the production web application, there's that risk that you could potentially damage customer data.
Right.
If you were able to gain high enough privileges. I have a staging environment that, in theory, is a mirror of that production. So if you target the staging environment, it should be the equivalent of testing the production environment. But we know that sometimes there's little differences in between one and the other.
There's always change differences.
So as a pen tester, if I were to come to you and say, what's your advice on that? Should should I be having my production application tested, or is it good enough to have the staging application tested, or is there some kind of middle ground you find on that?
So what I would do, what I'd recommend, and what I have recommended is that if you're concerned about testing on production, right, we can test on staging, but I need to have a mechanism that I can validate that it's one-to-one, right? And so that's the second piece of that engagement. Or actually, I'd make it the first piece, is let's validate that it's a one-to-one and that all the configurations are the same. I've worked with SaaS-based companies, providing applications for across the board, and you come in and they're like, oh, we're cookie cutter. We do the same thing over and over again. All right, let me research about your product. Oh, I can do X, Y, and Z, and I can change different behaviors. I can modify customizations. Not quite the same, right? Because there's a difference between an application configured vulnerability, right, that allows me to exploit one, not the other, versus a environment vulnerability. And so, with a company, I want to validate that the environment is a one-to-one. And a lot of times the security controls are on there. Maybe it doesn't have 2FA. Maybe it does. Who knows? One may, the other one may not. So we need to document what the deltas are, right? And then from there, we then can test that staging environment 100% and get a fairly close representation, I feel like, to get you the information you need. If you're concerned about the production environment because, say, we're in a quarter, right? And if we break down, we break, some sort of sales system,
It's a real
CRM,
a real issue.
absolutely. In a quarter, we've all got issues, right? Maybe we postpone it 3 weeks. Let's do beginning of quarter, the first week of the beginning of the quarter, or let's go second, so that way anything that's got to finishes up. So scheduling comes to be really important at that point. So again, I think there's multiple ways we can tackle it, whether it's technical, scheduling, or with your rules of engagement, we decide, hey, these types of attacks are too risky, don't do them. I've also had, if you find a vulnerability or something you're going to test, contact me first so that I know. We'll monitor it, let you do the test, and we'll go from there. So there's definitely multiple different ways to do it.
Yeah, I know. We for our infrastructure, we actually do have differences between our staging and production. Like we use a different certificate,
right?
And that sounds like a minor thing. Like your TLS certificate for the website shouldn't matter if it's different, but if it's a different bit strength, if it's a different expiration date,
what ciphers do you actually allow?
That can impact things. And we certainly do have different ones. We have a different web application firewall configuration and staging than because we don't want the whole world to get to staging. So those are all little changes that. Yeah, the application is identical between the two, but it would make testing them very different.
Well, think of it this way. Your monitoring and your logging are probably going to be different as well, right? So my logging on production is going to be probably 10 times more than my staging environment, because that's not where I'm expecting people to attack. And so if you're using the assessment to figure out if your MSSP or your analyst, whoever they are that are managing the SIM, what is that reaction time to figure out how to, to remediation, detection, remediation, and everything else, right? You're not going to have the same results. So again, if you go back to what I've been talking about in the training, we talk about scoping and some of the questions that I ask of why are you doing this, right? What is the purpose? What are you looking to get out of this? And based off of those, we can come up with some sort of solution.
Now, what if we go a step further and we take like production and staging out of the picture? I know that there's several companies that have started offering static code analysis, where they say, look, just you give us access to your GitHub repository, and we just look right at the code as opposed to the servers and the running applications. Do you have any experience with that? Is that effective?
It's definitely effective. The problem is some of the real world effectiveness. A good example is again, I got good examples from when I worked at the software development shop, right? So we enabled static code analysis, and I enabled it. There's like 1,000 different things that it found, right? And I'm like, holy cow! Like I've been, all major releases got pen tested. We've got dynamic scanning. Like, how is our code this bad, right? And what you end up finding is legacy functions or operations that may not be used today that were previously used. You may find variable names. A good one is variable names. So if you name a variable password, but it's a temporary variable to hold a null space in a form, right? So it's assigned null. You can't assign it to anything, but it's holding a null value into the password, into that form, right? Your static code analysis is going to flag on that. And so it's going to look as a critical because I have a password defined in my application. Is it, the other thing is I found it wasn't effective to turn on all the rules. Like you got to your OS top 10, but when I come back with 1,000 things and I give that to R&D, I lose all legitimacy, right? They're like, yeah, I'll put it on the backlog.
Yeah.
Sure.
1,000 entries.
Exactly. And it goes nowhere, right? And so if you have a mature program and the static code analysis is done at different levels, absolutely. Or you can do it at small chunks. So on commits, right, within your Git, right? Do it then. It's, smaller pieces of code. You can remediate those things faster, quicker. And remember, the sooner you can identify the vulnerability within the SDLC process, the cheaper it is to remediate. Like if your QA team is finding a vulnerability, or if I'm finding a vulnerability on a build, right? That's a lot of money to remediate versus, on check-in, do a quick scan, and if it finds these basic things, flag it and get it remediated before it even moves forward.
Yeah, and when you've got the team already looking at that piece of code, it becomes that much more simple.
Absolutely. Well, you kick it back to the original developer and say, hey, do it this way. Validate your input. Call it done, right? It makes it super quick, easy. They can do it in 20 minutes and,
Easy stuff to miss, though, when they're in a hurry trying to hit a deadline.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. Well, Brad, I think that wraps up the questions that we've got there. And I think that's about it. Before we wind this one down, did you have any other comments or topics that you wanted to speak on?
No, I don't have anything off the cuff, but I'm happy to be here. I'm excited with everything we're doing, and I like promoting different aspects of security. The pen testers. One of the pen testing things that I try to explain is when I was getting in my career and getting into pen testing, I didn't know if the skills that I was learning were going to correlate to other pieces of security, right? So, if I do this, will I get pigeonholed? And I don't think that's the case. I think that you'll get a mindset, and you can use that mindset. You can use these skills with anything, really, whether it's understanding how to attack and maybe the signatures that come with it, right? So if you get into operations, how do you identify? Well, if you know the types of attacks and the signatures that they create or the tails that they create, that's what you look for, right? How would I break into the system, right? That's what I'm going to monitor the most, right? So, one of the things is like I said, it's a great place to jump in and learn a lot of really cool skills. And, we talk about physical security sometimes, so it gets overlooked. I always travel with my lockpick set, but I was with a company and they lost their rack keys for the server, right? So we're in maintenance night. They're doing an upgrade on the firewall. Nobody knows where the keys are, right? I grab my lockpick set. I get into the rack. I'm like, go ahead, right? I mean, stupid things, but
Yeah.
It's definitely good skills to have.
Some use of it turns up somewhere. And fortunately, with the basically a job shortage, there's just not enough trained professionals in the field.
Sure.
You can pick your specialization, and if you change your mind, there's certainly openings to be able to move into that.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's about it for our Ask Me Anything. I do want to remind everybody a couple of different things. First off, if you want to see more Brad Stine, he's here filming with us all week long. You can check him out by tuning into ITPro.TV/live, usually filming in between 9:30 a.m. and about 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern throughout this week. They are filming a lot of practical pen testing, great knowledge there, and we're really appreciative of that. We also have a couple of webinars coming up that you want to tune in for. On August 16th, we've got a webinar with, I believe it's with Mr. Wes Bryan, who's going to be doing preparing for your CompTIA A+ exam. For those of you studying for that first step on your IT journey, he's going to help get you there. And on August 23rd, we have a webinar featuring this guy, where we're going to be talking about distributed denial of service attacks. We're going to give you a real-world demonstration of a denial of service attack that was performed against our very site, against ITProTV. I'll show you all of the evidence that we gathered, how we detected the attack, how we stopped the attack temporarily, and how we ultimately stopped the attack permanently, and kind of show you all the details and the stuff that people don't usually talk about for whatever reason. We like to share that. So tune in for that one on August 23rd. You'll definitely want to check that one out. Check out our social media channels. You'll find links for both webinars, as well as more Ask SME Anything. We always encourage you to send us your questions. If you're watching this recorded and you missed the show, you can still throw questions out there. We collect them all the time. We queue them up, and then we answer them right here. And we've been focused on security and pen testing on this one. But remember, if you have questions in any topic area, databases, development, Microsoft Office, certainly not my area, but we have Ms. Vaughn Smith, who is an office wizard. We bring in the subject matter experts, we answer those questions, and we get you guys the information that you need. Well, that's about it for this show, so we're going to wrap it up. Brad, thank you again for coming on the show with us.
Thank you for having me.
And for you viewers out there, thank you guys for watching. But signing off for ITProTV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And Brad Stine.
And we will see you next time.
Cool.
Are you enjoying Ask Me Anything? Then be sure to check out our other podcast, TechNado, where we take a look at the most interesting tech news stories from the week and interviews from people in the industry. Here's the latest episode, and here's the full playlist. And as always, be sure to subscribe to ITProTV's channel.
ITProTV.